So the new Sonos Era 100 and Sonos Era 300 are great sounding smart speakers that give you a very balanced and open listening experience. However, these speakers are a little pricey and they do have their Sonos quirks. But if you're trying to choose between either the Era 100 and Era 300, let's see how these two speakers stack up to one another and let's see which one's right for you. Regarding pricing, the Era 100 retails for $250 and the Era 300 retails for $450. Now, given that these are Sonos speakers, I don't expect them to go on sale all that often, and if they do, they're not going to go on sale by much. Nonetheless, if you want to pick either of these two speakers up, they'll be linked down below. And if you want to further support the channel, pick up a Big Head approved hat. It helps the unsponsored and unbiased reviews coming. We've got trucker hats and snapbacks. Now first, I just want to make it perfectly clear that in this video, we're going to be comparing the sound performance between these two speakers. Everything else about these speakers is basically identical. So if you want to learn more about the setup process or placement, or if you want to learn more about connectivity, then I highly recommend that you watch their full reviews, because in this video, we're only going to be talking about speaker setups and sound. But with all of that out of the way, we can now start talking about how these two speakers actually sound. Now, when it comes to speaker setups, the Era 100 has a very conventional speaker setup. We've got a single frontward firing woofer and dual frontward firing tweeters. Whereas with the Era 300, this speaker has a much wilder setup. The Era 300 has dual woofers which shoot out the sides, and the Era 300 has a total of 4 tweeters on it. One of which shoots out the front, 2 shoot out the sides and slightly upwards, and 1 shoots out the top. Now, just due to the speakers' different speaker setups, their placement options are a little different. Now, first off, the Era 100 is just noticeably smaller than the Era 300. So obviously, placing the speaker is just going to be a little easier. But also with the Era 100, since all of its sound is just coming out the front, you can place it anywhere. Whereas with the Era 300, placing the speaker is a little trickier. Since the speaker does have an upward firing tweeter, ideally you want to place it somewhere where its top isn't obstructed, and ideally you want to place it somewhere where the top has a direct line of sight to the ceiling, because you want sound to be able to bounce off of the ceiling. But also, since the speaker shoots out the majority of its sound through its sides, you don't want to place the speaker in a cabinet. Ideally, you want to place the Era 300 somewhere where it isn't cluttered and somewhere where it's just going to have space to breathe. Now, before we can actually start the sound test, I do have to point out that both of these speakers do sound rather flat when you take them out of the box. And personally, this doesn't surprise me because Sonos speakers never really have too much physicality in their bass. But thankfully, you can adjust the bass and treble on both of these speakers, and with both the Era 100 and Era 300, I like to use them with their bass raised by 5 clicks. So right now we're going to jump into the sound test. Both of these speakers are playing with their bass raised by 5 clicks, and both of these speakers are playing at 75% volume.
She's a itty bitty spider with a itty bitty lighter and a straight jacket round her waist. When she gets a bite, you better run, you better hide, better pray that you're not worth the chase. Yeah, she might be pretty, but I promise it gets scary once you want your daddy and she finds out where you live. Creeping in the shadows, eating poisoned apples. She's nothing like you ever seen. Her move goes up and down and round, and ain't no telling what she might do next. Cause she's a itty bitty spider with a itty bitty lighter, and she might just come for you. Should always sleep with one eye open. You better keep in mind to always look over your shoulder. Cause when you think you're safe to stay awake, she's moving closer. Cause she's a itty bitty spider with a itty bitty lighter, and she might just come for you. She's a itty bitty spider with a itty bitty ladder and she miss. Just come fall.
So obviously, since these two speakers are from the same series, they are going to sound very similar to one another. However, the Era 300 does sound a little bit more open than the Era 100. Since the Era 100 has those two frontward-firing tweeters shooting directly at you, their highs are going to be a little bit more emphasized, and the speaker just isn't going to sound as open as with the Era 300. Whereas with the Era 300, since it has a total of 4 tweeters, one shooting directly at you, 2 shooting out the sides and slightly upwards, and then 1 just shooting upwards. And since its 2 woofers are also shooting out the sides, the Era 300 does sound a little bit more open than the Era 100 simply because sound is just coming at you from multiple different directions. But honestly, the main reason why it's a big deal that the Era 300 has these angled and upward firing tweeters on it is because the Era 300 has Dolby Atmos support. Now what Dolby Atmos is, instead of your music just coming out over the left side and right side of your speaker and everything just being on the same plane, Dolby Atmos gives your music a sense of verticality to it. That's why I've already emphasized multiple times that when placing the Era 300, you want to place it somewhere where it's going to have a room to breathe, but also you want to place it somewhere where the Era 300 is going to have a direct line of sight to your ceiling. So that way, the upward firing tweeter has something to bounce sound off of. Now, Dolby Atmos is going to make your music sound more open and more lifelike, but just keep in mind, everything doesn't automatically have Dolby Atmos, and maybe your streaming service of choice might not have Dolby Atmos either. However, whether you're listening to Dolby Atmos content or not, the Era 300 is going to sound noticeably more open than the Era 100. Now, when it comes to max volume performance, both of these speakers get decently loud for their size. However, the Era 100 is going to be better suited for a small or medium-sized room, whereas the Era 300 is going to have an easier time filling a larger room with sound. But nonetheless, the Era 300 does get noticeably louder than the Era 100. And finally, there's the bass on these speakers. Now, like I mentioned earlier, these two speakers don't have a lot of physicality on their bass, but the Era 300 does have more physicality in its bass than with the Era 100. However, with both of these speakers, you can always connect one of Sonos's wireless subs to them, and that way you're really going to be able to feel your music. Now, I don't think that this would make a lot of sense with the Era 100, but this could make sense if you have an Era 300. But with all that being said, both the Era 100 and Era 300 are great sounding speakers that sound very balanced and very open. However, if you are trying to choose between getting the Era 100 and Era 300, with the Era 300 it is going to sound noticeably more open than the Era 100 whether you're listening to Dolby Atmos content or not. It's also going to get louder, so it's going to have an easier time of filling a larger room with sound, and the Era 300 does have a little bit more physicality in its bass than the Era 100. But price aside, one of the reasons why you might want to get the Era 100 over the Era 300 is simply because of its size. The Era 100 is noticeably smaller than the Era 300, so placing the speaker is just going to be a little easier. But also with the Era 100, all of its sound just comes out of the front like a normal speaker. Whereas with the Era 300, I do recommend that you think about where you're going to place the speaker before you buy it, because the Era 300 does need room to breathe. If you made it this far, I guess you enjoyed the video, so hit the like button and get subscribed. If you want to pick any of the products up, they'll be linked down below. And if you want to further support the channel, check out the merch. I made some shirts and hoodies that look and feel great. And you know I can be very particular, so I'll only slap my name on something if I'm really proud of it.